So hello, Sasha. I'm going to read just a short beginning of your Wikipedia intro, and it goes as follows.
I don't know who puts that information out there.
Only, I assure you, only good stuff. It's all good.
Okay.
So Sasha דיג'וליאן, who was born in October 23rd, 1992, is a professional rock climber who in 2012 became the first American woman to climb grade 514D, which for us is 9A. She has climbed over 30 first female ascents as well as 8 significant first ascents. In 2015, she became the first woman to free climb Magic Mushroom, 7C+, one of the most difficult routes on the north face of the Eiger in Switzerland. In 2017, she did the first female ascent of Big Wall in Madagascar, Mora Mora, 8C, climbing with Edu Marine, in what was also the second free ascent of Mora Mora. Now, I can go on and on about your achievements, but I think that's enough just to understand the scope of some of your achievements. So again, hi, Sasha. Thank you so much for being here with us, especially being after surgery. So we obviously all know you, but perhaps you can introduce yourself. Where are you from? Where were you born?
Sure. No, with that introduction, thank you. I'm glad that Wikipedia didn't have some random facts in there.
It's all in the rest of the stuff that I read, but I decided to leave it out.
Oh yeah, great. So I live in Boulder, Colorado now. I'm originally from Washington, D.C. That's where I grew up. My mom is from Montreal though, and that's where she lives. So we spent a lot of time growing up in both countries, Canada and the U.S. And my entire family is in Canada. My mom's side of the family is Jewish, so I wasn't really raised any sort of religion in particular, but I am Jewish. So that's a fun fact that some of you guys may not know.
We're very proud of our Jewish connections, so that's always
yeah,
good.
that's awesome. I've never been to Israel, but I'd really like to come. My dad was from Italy, and then I went to school in New York City at Columbia University, and that was during the same time that I was still a professional climber, and there was a lot of kind of balancing there of figuring out how to be a full-time student and a professional athlete. But since graduating, now I've really focused on my career as a climber, and I also founded a production company called Female Focused Adventures. And my goal with that is to really harness female content in the adventure space and to try and engage more female content creators from the video production, directing, and capturing to the actual athletes and the content that we can put out there. So it's all new and fresh and stuff that I'm working on. But yeah, I guess that brings us to present day.
Yes. So actually that covers a lot of what you do, and you do quite a lot of things. Maybe we should start with the beginning, how you started climbing.
Sure. That's I started climbing after my brother had a birthday party at a climbing gym in just outside of Washington, D.C. I was 6, so it was 1998. I'm 27 now. So I've been climbing for 21 years. And there was just something that I really liked about it. Like, it was the fact that I could control my progression up the wall. It was up to me to reach the top. And I think that that was something that stuck. But I didn't know that it was like any sort of sport or anything until about a year later. I walked into the climbing gym and they were holding this youth regional championships. And I was like, what is this? You know, and the organizers let me compete. And I won my category, which I think was like 11 and under at the time. I was 7. And that kind of catalyzed like me starting to compete and get more involved with climbing on a sport level. So my background was really inside, and that was what I grew up with, was like indoor climbing competitions and going to climbing team practice during the week. And weekends I would go to like the Red River Gorge sometimes, or the New River Gorge. But my focus was really in the like first decade and a half of my career on competitions.
So actually, I wanted to ask about the competitions. You mentioned that it was the first competition that made you realize, okay, this is something I want to do seriously.
Yeah.
So what seriously means? How many trainings per week, per day? How did your training look like?
Yeah, seriously, at age 7 was, it's all relative. I think that what I really liked about the competition, though, was it was my first time going to this climbing gathering where there was kids from my age and from other ages similar to me that I could connect with, because climbing over the last 10 years has really grown exponentially. But this is like late 90s, and climbing in the US at least was still really fringe, and not that many people knew about it. At my school that I went to from kindergarten to 12th grade, like, I was probably the only, if not one of the very few that climbed or knew anything about it. So finding that community was really meaningful to me. And that's kind of what happened after that first competition, was like, wow, there's all these kids from the tri-state area, which is like DC region that I grew up in, who are like as fanatic about climbing as I am. And there's like actually a program that I can do, kind of like, I was figure skating competitively at that time, but it was something similar to that I could partake in. So I guess it was kind of like that gateway. And then training, it's like blossomed as I've gotten more serious with it. Training's become more serious. But as a kid, the most important thing that I still think for every kid is like, training is just climbing. Like, do it as much as you can, get that volume, have fun with it. Don't take it too seriously. Like, I think that you can't really like do weights and stuff like that at a young age safely. And I could be wrong, but I definitely didn't do that.
Actually, that's true for beginning climbers, even in the older ages. Climbing in their first year, I wouldn't recommend doing too many hangboards and stuff, and mainly climbing and enjoying the sport. And at what point did it become really serious? Training and competitions, and like, was there like a clear point where you said, okay, this is something I'm going to go for?
Yeah, it's funny because there were different points that it became serious. And like, to me personally, it became probably the more serious at around 11 or 12. At 11, I won my first international competition, which was like a youth continental championships. And at 12, I had my first endorsement deal. And, the endorsement deal was really minimal. It was maybe like free gear or something like that. But I was being recognized for my achievements, which I think to me was this proving ground that I was doing something right and that I was succeeding. And I really started focusing in on my goals within the competition circuit from about like 11 onwards, because I was like, I really want to compete on the highest level, like the World Cup circuit, and it would be a dream one day to win the World Championships. And like, I had these like goals that were very fixated on competitions. And at 18 was when I won the World Championships in Arco, Italy, for a female open. And I think that was a really big turning point for me too, because in my career, my whole life had been like dedicated to succeeding in competitions and really enjoying that. Like, I loved going to comps and like being with my friends, and it was like a social thing. I like loved the like after parties because we had trained so hard and like been so focused, and then you kind of like get to release and have fun, and like other people that love this sport too, that wasn't that common for me growing up where I did. Like, there weren't that many people, other kids who climbed too. So sharing in that and like that community aspect of competitions was really a big part of what drove me to want to get better. But at 18, after I won the World Championships, it was kind of like, now what? Now, like, what's my next goal? And I was a really goal-oriented person. And that was when I started really kind of focusing my attention more on outdoor climbing. And from that point on, I started losing the motivation that I once had for that like really tubular focus in the competition arena to then think like I went on some more climbing trips outside and like had like less pressure because I had just like achieved the like dream goal of winning the world championships. I was just like stoked on life. And climbing outside started to become this new avenue of mine that I just enjoyed a lot more. It was like, you're not in isolation before you go out to the competition. You get to like spend this time with your friends working on a climb. If you fall, like, so what? You lower to the ground and you try it again. Versus in a comp, like, you know, you're like in ISO for 2 hours, warming up, being super like strict about everything. And then you go out to the competition floor and like, if you like fall or have a foot slip on like the finals route, that's it. So I think that element of like performance and climbing was sticking more, and just being outside and getting to travel around the world to these amazing locations to just like experience the environment was what started really captivating me more about the sport.
Do you have a memory of a significant failure experience in
Totally.
comps?
Yeah, it's like so memorable. In 2010, so I guess the year before I won the adult female overall world championships, I was in what I felt like really good shape. I had been training a lot. I had won like some of the like youth lead cups in Europe, and I wanted to win the junior world championships so badly. And it was in Scotland. It was in Edinburgh. And I had like topped out my qualifiers, and I had topped out my semifinals route. And I was like one of the maybe I was the only person to do so, or maybe one of two. And so I went into finals pretty confident, and we had this route that was on like a slab, and my foot just like popped. And like, I just remember that moment where I was like lowering down, and I knew like I had not won. I think I came sixth that year or something, but it was just like this heart-wrenching devastation that I felt like I would never get over. And I still remember it, you know, but I definitely got over it.
So it was a devastating experience.
Totally devastating. I was so upset. And, you know, with like the youth comps, like you go back home and you go back to school, and like life keeps moving forward. And, you know, it's like kind of like climbing competitions were this like other side of me, outside of me as a student in this like little bubble that I grew up in of like going to school and being really focused on academics, that when I got back to school, it was like my friends from school weren't climbers, and they didn't know that I had just like had my heart broken by some like failure. And so yeah, it was hard. It was like, but then it motivated me. I think that year was a big turning point too, because like after that competition, I was like, I want to train so hard that even on my worst day, on my worst mess ups, I am still the best. And that was like what I wanted. And what kind of drove me for like through good parts and bad parts. Like I was really motivated. I was really strict on like everything I ate, everything that, you know, incorporating like cardio before school, and then going to the climbing gym after. That'd be like running on a treadmill at like 6 a.m. and then going to class. And that I think that that really helped me in like the competitive spirit of things. But I've always, I think, been pretty hard on myself, and that time frame I was improving and climbing, but maybe mentally and physically I was taking some taxation on like my overall health. So it was a time in my life, and I look back at it and I'm like, you were way more motivated. But I think that it's like there's positives and negatives.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, this entire, a big part of any athlete's life is the mental aspect. Is that something you cope with on your own? Did you have a coach who guided you in that aspect, or was that something that was only you with yourself?
Yeah, the mental aspect is huge. And I think that it's something that I'm still trying to figure out. And through my youth, I grew up with this coach named Claudio Vidiolescu, who was from Romania. And he was my coach from when I was about 7 years old till 14. And then I worked with this guy named Vadim Vineker, who had competed on the World Cup circuit himself. And he was from, I think it was Russia or Ukraine. I have to text him after for apologizing for forgetting. And then I started dating Magnus Mitbo when I was about 16 years old. And he was like a professional climber at the time. And we kind of started like going on trips together. And he was like, honestly, my coach. Like, he taught me a lot of things about climbing that I still carry with me to, like, if you want to improve, then get on a hard climb. If you want to experience what that next level is, then try it. So stuff like that was, I think, mentally pushed me. And now I do work with a sports psychologist, and also a psychologist that really works with athletes who are going through injuries, which has been something that Red Bull has provided me that I'm really grateful for during this time, because I've never gone through such a long injury process. And also I have lost a lot of friends to climbs and to the mountains. And it starts weighing on you. Like, after Mexico, when Nolan passed away, I would go to the local crag, and like everything I grabbed felt like it was going to break from the wall and like cut my rope, and like that would be it. And it was hard to understand, like, why am I doing this? Like, and then I think, like, you're afraid to fall. And my philosophy has always been, when I teach like retreats and stuff, like, take the fall. Like, you have to confront what you're most scared of in order to figure out how to overcome it. But I think that as a professional athlete and as a climber who's done a lot of climbs, like, something that I always try to remind other people is, like, I still get scared on lead. Like, it doesn't go away magically when you like achieve something. Like, there are still moments and days that I have to respect that, like, my fear level is just a lot higher than other days. And sometimes I challenge it, and sometimes I just like respect it. So I think there's like that balance there that you have to kind of personally learn.
It's actually interesting. So there are so many emotional and psychological aspects to climbing. And in tennis, for example, which is another sport I really enjoy, having a psychologist, a sports psychologist, is something that is almost all the athletes, all the tennis players have. And in climbing, I feel like we're not quite there yet, although we should be. And losing friends and loved ones and being afraid. And it's a tremendous part of it. And in another aspect, you spoke about enjoying competitions on the one hand, meeting friends, and on the other hand, having a lot of pressure. So I'm curious, it was very relevant then, but it's also relevant now. How do you deal with pressure? There are many expectations. You have sponsors. Maybe we can start from the early days, from the competitions. How did you deal with it? You were very young.
Yeah. I think that when I was younger, it was almost easier to deal with pressure than I think as you grow up and your living is really tied to these expectations, then the stakes become higher. But I think what I always think of, like, rooting it in is that youthful just enjoyment. And that's how I got over the pressure when I was young. And it's how I try and get over the pressure now. Is like, as a young climber going to youth nationals or whatever, you know, it was like this one moment of my year that I looked forward to so much. And I was so nervous, like, especially before semifinals, because I always found that round was like the most indicative. Like, you need to do well, not mess up, make it to finals, then you could go all out, you know? And I listened to music. Like, I had like a few songs that I had like on just like repeat when I was in isolation. Like, one was actually Tide is High. I'm gonna embarrass myself by saying that.
Please do.
Yeah, that was like one of my go-tos. But it was just like almost like the similar concept of a mantra of like, the tide is high, but I'm holding on. And I think that helped me a lot. And as I got older, there was definitely an element of competitions that became less fun the more the expectation of like me doing well at them would become. Like, I felt like towards the end of my competition career, I would go to competitions and it would be like a letdown if I didn't win. And that's like such a negative way to look at it, because really like you're stripping away the enjoyment of the process and everything that kind of goes into like just like performance and being there in the moment, not thinking about the end result. And I guess how I can relate it is when I think about like a big mountain that I want to climb, or a big wall, and it has like, say 30 pitches of climbing, like I can't think about the top. I have to think about like each pitch and then break it down to its little parts. And maybe within that pitch, there's a crux. So I need to figure out that sequence. And it's like, it's never that whole.
In tennis, it's play the next point. Don't think further.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of sports, like, it's interesting you mentioned like the fact that sports psychology and climbing are relatively new, because I find the same. Like, I think that our knowledge in nutrition, in mental aspects, in physical training outside of climbing, like there are a lot of new horizons that we're experiencing in the sport that are still kind of like Wild West, you know? And I think that there's a lot more knowledge that we can explore and implement into bettering our sport and performances, but also just like our health that goes around it. Malnutrition is something that I've gone through, that a lot of climbers that I know have gone through, for instance, and that sparked my interest to learn more about nutrition, because it's like we can easily recognize the sport is a strength to body weight ratio sport. And when you're really fit and climbing well, you want to be at a weight that you feel is like not too much excess. But then how do you get there? And like, I think that traditionally, without the knowledge of nutrition, you can get there through really unhealthy, unsustainable means. And through physical knowledge of training our bodies in a way that we know more about what weight training can do and different tactics of periodization, we can get there without changing our actual body composition, but changing our mindset and our physical approach.
And how old were you when you decided to quit competitive climbing?
I stopped competition climbing about 2013. So it was, 7 years ago. I'm 27. So I guess it wasn't that. I was about probably 23 or 24.
And did you release like a statement? Was there like a decision, okay, I'm quitting, or was it just like a process?
It was kind of a process. I started going to less and less competitions. After the year that I won the World Championships, I started school at Columbia University, and so that was 2012. And so there was no way that I was going to have time to go to all the World Cups. So that was kind of the first thing. And then I still went to like the Pan American Championships and the ARCO Lead Master and some of the events like that. But I started just kind of like phasing out, and then I would go to like some of the Lead Masters and the bigger events, but not any of the smaller ones. And I think that actually, in looking back, I wouldn't recommend that to someone, because the thing about smaller competitions is it's great practice. And in order to really do well at the bigger competitions, you need to have that depth of experience and just like have gone through the different changing fields of setting changes and getting to know like your systems for performance and isolation timing and stuff like that, that I think that I don't regret it, because it just didn't make sense within my schedule of being a student. But had I been like how to approach competitions, what I would recommend to someone is do as many competitions as you can if you want to succeed in competitions. And if you have the ability to compete on the World Cup circuit, then go to all of the events that you can, because when it comes down to the finale or the World Championships, you'll be that much more accustomed to those formats than you would have been if you stopped. So I think that my statement more or less was more just like the statements that I started to have on my results outside, and that became kind of like it spoke for itself, and in the way of like, okay, this is my direction, this is what I'm focusing on.
Okay, actually, some of our participants now are actually professional athletes. Some of them are highly successful in attempting to get to the Olympics. So I feel like your kids awesome. are quite, yes, definitely. And when you were 18, if I'm not mistaken, you sent Pure Imagination, the first female send of a 514D 9A. Am I correct?
Yeah.
And that was actually when you were still competing.
Yeah, so it was the fall after the World Championships that I won. So in 2011, in June, I graduated from high school, and I decided to defer my acceptance to Columbia for a year so I could just focus on climbing. And then in about July was the ARCO World Championships, and then in October was when I did Pure Imagination. And then that following spring was when I climbed Eravea, which was my second 9A in Spain.
Can you share a bit about the experience of, okay, I can do this? How did you train for it? What was the process? How long did it take?
Oh, it was like a total surprise. I like had no idea.
Really?
Yeah, I did Pure Imagination on my third day of trying it on my sixth try. But that credit actually belongs to like the friends that I had who convinced me to like try it. I knew of this route because the Red River Gorge was the like relatively nearby crag to where I grew up from, and it was about an 8-hour drive. I'd go to the Red over weekends, and this line had been put up by Jonathan Segrist and edited and filmed by my friend Andy Mann. And I watched the video and I was like, this line looks like amazing. It looks so inspiring. I just want to try it. I just want to like feel what that next level of like climbing feels like, because I had never been on a 9A before. The spring before I had done like a few 8C pluses and stuff like that. But like the concept of me sending it was still so far-fetched. But I went down to the Red and I was with my friend Vian and Keith, who was filming, and Andy, who was also filming. And it was like, I just remember the first day I got on it and I was like, I did all the moves, but like, what does that even mean? And like, normally I've always been like, if you can do all the moves of a climb, you can do it. But it was still kind of it was like all the moves were like, I could do them, but they were just barely I could do them. So then the second day I tried it, and like I had like all of my like fingers were bleeding and stuff. The rock was super sharp. So I took a rest day, and then actually I started trying a different climb just to get some headspace away from it. And then on my third day going back onto the climb, I thought that I was just going to go through like try and figure out how, if I could go from the ground through the first crux, and because that was like one of the hardest moves for me. And I was like, then I planned to like just like stop at that bolt and like rest and like brush and whatever. But I'd gotten through that first sequence and I was like, oh my God, I should like keep going and try and get through this second sequence. And then I kept climbing. I got through the second sequence, and then I was like, this third like really crux area of the route and the top are like all that's preventing me, so I may as well just like go for it. And that was when I started getting like nervous, and I was like, I don't know if like I'm just gonna like pop off. It's almost like the competition anxiety of like if my foot slipped or something. And it was funny because like Keith and Andy were filming the entire thing, and Andy was above me, so he was like jumaring as fast as he could to, like capture but also like get out of my way so he wasn't like kicking rocks into my eyes and like ruining the ascent. And so it was a pretty memorable moment. And I think that honestly, like, you know, Pure Imagination has been downgraded since to possibly be 8C plus, and to me I still remember it as my first 9A, because I'm just like, that was what it meant to me at the time. And grades are so irrelevant anyways. Like I've been on 8C pluses that I haven't done that have felt like harder than the 9As I have done. And then like with my experience with Ayurveda, I tried it and then I had to do a return trip because I didn't do it and I felt close, but I was like, I actually returned and went to the US Nationals, which I won. And then I trained, and then I flew back and I did it. And so I think that like through the process of these different routes, and through all of these routes, like from 8C plus to like, I mean, 8As, like some 8As are like so freaking nails that like I can't do. And then
I say, fuck them. It's a 9A. I'm with you. It's a 9A. I did want to ask, so there was another 9A in Spain, but in general, do you have a memorable, frustrating experience of a project, one that maybe you sent, maybe you didn't send, it's not the point, but about the frustration and the process, the long process?
Yeah, a lot of them. I think one of them in particular is Pata Negra, which was a 8C climb in Spain in Rodear. And Rodear was where I did my first 514As, first 8B plus, and actually my first 8C too. And I love that area, but there was this climb called Pata Negra. There was an 8C that I just couldn't do like for years. I tried it, I think like 3 different years, and I could never do it. And then
that was the one that was done by Danny Andrade, right? Or it's not that one?
Yeah, it might have been him. Johnny Andrade is like the king of every route in Spain, so it wouldn't.
It's a fair guess.
I wouldn't say that that's a far-fetched guess. But I remember one year I went back in, I think it was like 2015 or something, and I went over with my friend Courtney Sanders and Robin Eversfield, and we were on this kind of like girls trip, and I decided to try Pata Negra, and I remember like it was like my focus of that trip, and when I did it, it was pretty surreal because it was like kind of one of those climbs that always spit me off, and like I would try just for fun and like a little gauge on like my fitness level, and sometimes I wouldn't even make it to the top because I just feel like this is pointless and falling everywhere. So I've definitely had a lot of climbs like that where it's been hard to put the pieces together, and maybe I can do all the moves, but there's some mental thing that I always fall in the last move or something like that. And so I think that like what I've learned is creating space and coming back to it later can be really helpful. That was even with Ayurveda, I found helpful, like to give a little space to let my mind, and like I think in that process, I was just like, I want to climb this climb so badly. We were filming it for Real Rock at the time, so there's kind of like pressure, and I would wake up and kind of feel like people were expecting me to send it. And I think I needed like that space to be like, okay, I'm here. I'm like just going to try it, and I'm just going to try my best and not try and live up to anyone else's expectations. There's a lot of these routes in my past that I've like struggled on and had to return to. That's always kind of been the mantra of mine.
It's so interesting how so many of the either failures or successes go back to the mental aspect. And when I read your intro from your Wikipedia, it said quite a few female ascents. And I wanted to ask you about that. You're quite an advocate for gender equality and promoting women on sports and in general. And I wanted to ask you about that. How do you perceive female ascents and in general? Does it matter? Do you feel that women can do the same as men? What is your perception for this entire big question?
Yeah, I think that that's a great question. I think that female ascents are really significant in that they acknowledge a historical moment in climbing where a woman does something. I think that they are important to be within the relative scale of like this ascent was significant for both genders. And what I guess the Wikipedia page doesn't say is like the over 30 female ascents that I've done have been 8B plus and harder. So that to us is like 514 and harder. And it's hard to put like a number onto what's significant because you may have a big wall that's graded like 7C plus, and that's really significant because there's all these other factors of like for the Eiger, it was a significant thing for me because it wasn't just the single sport climbing grade. It's like you have so many pitches stacked on top of each other and so many variables. But how I've always stood with first female ascents is, I think that women are just as capable of men as climbing just as hard, if not harder. I think that the terrain depends. I think that women typically can really excel on like endurance and technique, and men physiologically do have more power. Just anatomically, that's something that does happen. But in climbing, that's the beauty of the sport, is that it's not just power and it's not just physique. It's about what your technique is and your ability to compartmentalize what's going on in your mind, and also solve sequences and be creative. And so I think that acknowledging when a female is the first to do something is significant to me, because I look at climbs and like, if a woman's done something, I'm like inspired. I'm like, I can do this because she did it, you know? And so I think when you go and you do a first female ascent of something that's been done only by men before, it kind of sets the precedent of women can do it too. And I think that that is really important, and it shouldn't be taken as like this negative thing of saying women are lesser than men. I think that women and men are equal, but acknowledging the success that we have in a traditionally male-dominated sport is important.
So that's actually interesting. You state quite clearly a male-dominated sport. So how do you perceive the word, specifically in climbing? Because I would like to think of climbing as a pretty decent sport and nice and pretty equal. But I'm a male. I'm a man.
Right.
So I'm interested in your perspective.
Yeah, I think that traditionally there have been many more men who climb than women, just on a statistical ratio. And I think that that's changing as more climbing gyms equal out and more women get involved with climbing. Something I will say about climbing is that the prize money for men and women has always been equal, which is really progressive. And I think that that's the way it should be in all sports. But I know that there's different reasons for that in other sports too. So it's hard to equate my experience, but I think that the experience of a woman in climbing, my experience as a woman in climbing, has been, there are so many other critiques that we experience, and that's chatter about what you look like, discussion about what you weigh, discussion about who you're dating. Like, I can't even acknowledge the times that I've been asked, like, am I single? And like, does having a professional career impact my happiness because I don't have a man? And it's like, first of all, I try and keep my private life private. But I'm like, why? Those questions don't even pertain to my experience as a professional climber. Like, it has no relevance. But then I think that women also can be second guessed. And that's something I've experienced too, of like, whether I deserve the success that I've had, that I've frankly worked really hard to achieve. And like these other factors that kind of reattribute the success that you have because you're a woman. And I think that that's something that we all need to acknowledge. And like, I have privilege pertaining to present day circumstances. Like, I'm white and I'm an American. Like, there is privilege in my race, which is like absolutely disgusting to me. But if we don't acknowledge and be aware of where our privileges are, but then where also like society needs to improve, then we won't move forward.
I used to work in education. I used to be a teacher, and one of my lesson plans was about gender equality, and I did it through sports. There is a female tennis player called Eugenie Bouchard. And after one of the matches she's won, the commentator asked her to give a twirl. She's good looking, and she was asked to give a twirl, and I showed the students that video, and then I asked them, is that a question male athletes would be asked to do? And it's pretty clear the answer is no. The interesting thing is one of the girls, the students, said, but Omer, I want to be perceived as pretty. I am a woman. And it's a very, very complicated issue. And I think that the only way to get past it is to talk about it and bring it to the surface. And there are clearly differences on the one hand, but equality is something that is extremely important. And I think our sport is a good way of promoting that. And that's about that. And there has been an extremely complicated situation with Joe Kinder. If you don't mind sharing about that, because it's a difficult one, but I know that you're okay about talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, my stance is so firm. It's like, if someone is maliciously targeting you to harass you, under any circumstances, this was something that went on for a long time, and I know that I wasn't the only woman targeted. Even if it was, like, it's not acceptable. And for someone to be using the privilege of being a sponsored athlete who's an ambassador for the community and misrepresenting the community by harassing someone, then that's not okay. And what happened there is I finally just stood up for myself and I said, this needs to stop. Like, this is enough. And I used my platform to use my voice. And as a professional athlete, like, yes, climbing is what got me to have a platform. But I think that in all parts of the way that we conduct ourselves as role models within a sport is like, if you don't use your voice for something that you believe in that provides deeper meaning and an ability for us to progress positively, then it's kind of like, why even have a voice? And I know that traditionally, like, celebrities have been told, like, just focus on your sport, don't get into politics, don't be controversial. And I totally disagree with that, because I think that in present day, we have followings and we have platforms in order to make change. And in that situation, like, I use my platform in order to make a change against cyberbullying, which I think under any circumstances isn't okay. And I hope that my experience with it, while it was a really vulnerable and divisive time, because I think that even some of my friends who are some other professional climbers, like, they didn't want to get involved because they wanted to stay neutral. But I think that staying neutral on things is actually taking a negative stance, because, like, you can't have an opinion and not share it and think that then by not sharing it, anything's going to change. So yeah, I hope that young girls and also young boys and people of all ages can see that experience and see, like, you have a right to stand up for yourself. And if you feel like something's not right, then say that and take a stance. So I guess that's all I have to say with that.
I first of all, I highly appreciate your choice to take a stand and say what you feel and what you think, and you promote many other fields. We know that in the NBA, for example, athletes state their opinions about politics all the time. In football, however, we have Kaepernick, who kneeled and was bad for it. And you still choose to do it, which is quite brave. And just like you stated, you could easily say, why should I get involved? I can only lose in many ways. But you still do it in many different fields as well. So maybe you can share a bit about your political activities, the things you do.
Yeah, I'm like an imperfect advocate, which I think is okay. I know the causes that I really believe in politics, and that's mainly regarding how it directly affects climbing. So protecting our public lands, advocating for climate preservation and climate action is really important, because in the U.S., at least, we have an administration right now that isn't in support of protecting our public lands, and they're auctioning off public lands for privatization and for totally unsustainable routes to create job economy, when we have an $887 billion outdoor recreation economy that provides sustainable jobs. So I think that that's been a really important cause for me. And I think that a lot of change happens on the legislative level. So going to Washington and lobbying on Capitol Hill, and then also aligning with organizations like, I'm an ambassador with Protect Our Winters and also the Access Fund and the American Alpine Club. and having conversations. Like recently, I think it was last week, I had a live conversation with one of the senators who's a senior senator, and he's up for re-election in 2020. His bills I really support. Like there's the Great American Outdoors Act and these Clean Economy Acts that are really moving our nation forward. And then on the other hand, you have a 2020 election where we can decide if we want Trump to still be our president, or do we want to go to an administration that's going to support the future of our sport and also the future of our planet. So I guess that's like the brief on the political. And then on the other organization that I feel really passionate about is the Women's Sports Foundation. And I'm on the board with the Women's Sports Foundation. And our philosophy there is equal play for equal pay, and bringing more media attention and also just attention like globally to women doing really great things in sports. And the transformative vehicle that is sport is so powerful. Like, as you mentioned, like teaching gender equality through sports. I think that through climbing, like I've learned so much about self-confidence and taking risk and believing in myself and setting goals. And that hard work and determination that's required. I think that that's like across all genders, youth can develop really positively through sport.
Mm-hmm. And you talked about challenges and learning about yourself, and you mentioned quitting competitive climbing. And how did you choose your next goals?
I'm just so inspired by the fact that climbing is such a multifaceted sport that you can always have new challenges in so many different terrains, even if you're a professional in one aspect. So like I reached my climactic moment in competition climbing when I won the world championships. And yes, now climbing is in the Olympics and like I'm not going for that. But I'm so excited. Like I'm so excited for the sport to be in the Olympics. And it's cool that you mentioned that there's some climbers or athletes on this chat who are like gunning for the Olympics, because like I think that it'll bring such a wide spread global stage to our sport, and educating more people about climbing has always been something that I want to happen. But as for setting goals, I think that I'm just like, if I see something, whether it's like the Canadian trilogy, for instance, was like my goal to do these 3 514 big walls in the Canadian Rockies. And I learned about that goal because I picked up a climbing magazine called Rock and Ice. And like I read this article that Sunny Trotter wrote, and like the photos were amazing. And I was like, well, I want to try these. Like I was just inspired. And so I think that I feel really grateful for that privilege that I have to like be able to look at a magazine and say, I want to go after this goal, and have like the support to do so. But that support's come through just like trying, you know, it's like you never really know what you're capable of until you try is like a mantra or saying that I always really turn to, because when I'm scared about a new idea or feel passionate about something, but I'm like, I don't really know if I can do it. Like I'd really like to write a book, for instance. But it's like, if I think of the book and I think about like, this is like El Cap or whatever. And like, you don't think about like getting to the top of El Cap. You think about like climbing it pitch by pitch. So maybe it's like chapter by chapter or like day by day. And then you just whittle down that process like any climb. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not like fearless in any way.
Mm-hmm. So first of all, thank you for the honesty. I have so many expeditions in a sense to choose from, but let's take the Eiger, magic mushroom, it's called.
Yeah, magic mushroom.
As a study case. So you talked about the initial stage of, okay, I'm fascinated by it, I'm excited about it, this is what I'm going to do. What's the next stage? How do you prepare for such an ascent, for such an expedition?
I think that something that goes into expedition planning is preparation. So knowing that you have controlled all of the variables that you can control. And when you're actually on like a big wall climb or something like this, like there is going to be weather, there's going to be rock fall, there's going to be ice fall, there's going to be factors that you can't control. The way that I approach it is train so I'm like in the best physical condition that I can be to withstand the endurance that's going to be required to actually perform on this climb. And then set a plan in place of like your packing. So you need to know like what food you need, how many days are you planning to be on the wall, what's the range there, how do you plan for what you need, and then also equipment. So like, do you have a Gore-Tex rain jacket? Probably a good idea if you're going somewhere with like not so great weather. Or do you have a down jacket? Are you like, you kind of like put all of these pieces that pack down into the puzzle, and I always lay them all out. So that's really getting into like the specifics of preparing, but you want to basically control all the variables and not be wondering like, wake up that day, even in competitions, like I would so much as the night before set out like my outfit and my hair tie and everything. So it was like, there's not even a question if I'm going to be stressing about looking for a hair tie to pull my hair back. Like it's there. All I need to focus on is this task at hand. And it's kind of like an expedition. Like you have your bag packed, you're ready to go. You know, you have your food, your like fuel, your climbing partner, like everything is laid out that you can then really focus on the task, which is climbing and being as safe as possible. And I think with a climb like the Eiger or this last like expedition, I did a full female expedition to this little island called Sao Tome off the west coast of Guinea in Africa. And it was one of the most dangerous, the most dangerous climbs I've ever done. And that was because of rockfall and the weather. And there is like a little bit of a rolling the dice. And like, I think it's a lot about like what sort of level of risk do you feel you can manage and mitigate enough to make wise decisions in order to stay alive, you know, and you have to make decisions that are going to be like, we quit because it's too dangerous. And then be also willing to figure out when you can move forward and it's safe enough. And there's a lot of mitigation of like separating your ego from what you really want to achieve. And then the realism of like the weather and like what the rock quality is, that you have to kind of balance out and then make a decision. So like with a situation like what happened with us in Mexico, when the tragedy happened with Nolan, it's like, I can say that Nolan was doing everything right. Like Nolan was such a like experienced climber, and was climbing a route that had bolts on it. The rock quality was like, you know, it's adventure as always with the big wall, but when the rock broke and it cut his rope and he died from that, it's not something that any of us can say that's never going to happen with 100% certainty, even if we go to our local sport crag. So I think that is one of those like caveats that makes it really difficult mentally. And so it comes down to a choice of like, what risk do you accept and how far do you want to take it?
It's very interesting. Again, we talked about losing loved ones and friends and whatnot. And had I been interviewing Alex Honnold, it would have been clear that he's putting his life at risk. But for what you do, it's kind of unclear, because on the one hand, you're choosing carefully, and you talk specifically about that very small gap between ego and desire and whatnot. And it's a big question. Do you perceive yourself to be putting your life at risk?
I think on every big wall expedition, I know that is the worst case scenario. I can't dwell on it, otherwise I wouldn't go. And it's what makes me feel alive, and it's what I love to do. And it's like, I think that I choose projects where I can feel comfortable with the level that I'm exposed to. But any accident can happen. You can't get in your car and say like, I'm not going to get in a car accident today, because you could be hit by a drunk driver. Like there are so many scenarios. That photo you have pulled up is from actually my first ice lead, and it was above Lake Superior on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And I was absolutely terrified. Like I was so scared, and it probably was not that difficult of terrain. But when you're ice climbing, like you don't want to fall. And so I think that was something that was really neat to learn too, was like, how do you get comfortable and confident enough that you're so certain in what you're doing that you're like, go. And there's parts of like, if you're climbing something on terrain and you're really run out and you know that the fall would be really bad if you took that fall, you're like, I can't fall here. And like, it's almost like you know that, but in your mind, you can't say, I can't fall. You have to just think like, focus, like right foot, right hand, left foot, or like left hand, like whatever it may be, like just really like tune into the sequence. Because as soon as you start doubting yourself, I think that's when the real like hesitation and failure actually can happen more likely.
Okay, so again, I really admire and appreciate your honesty. I can't believe it, but it's almost an hour past, and I have so many other topics and questions I would like to ask, but I'm gonna have just a few more short ones, and the next one would be, what's the project you're most proud of?
Oh, the project I'm most proud of. I think my Sao Tome project, which is, I'm working on it right now. And it's kind of like something that I'm excited to share with all of you guys in early 2021. But yeah, it was a really like difficult, mentally straining trip, and we ended up getting to the top. It was, in retrospect, like I don't even know, having gone through the losses that we've had since then, like if I would have been able to get in that mental headspace that we did. But we had a really good balance and communication across the team, and it was an all-female crew, which was one of my first trips doing that. And I self-financed it because it was something that I really believed in, and I wanted to have all these women really a part of the capturing team. So like our producer and our director and our on-camera filming, it was just like a project that I saw and went for, and it was a really cool experience.
Okay. Well, first of all, I wish you a speedy recovery, and of course your biggest dream now is to get back to climbing. But if I ask you about like you walking, going back to basics, dumping the crutches. Can you share about your like next big dream or dreams, perhaps?
I would really like to go back down to Mexico and honor Nolan and do the climb with the team we had in place. And that's kind of like guiding me, honestly. Like it's like was something that I was training really hard for up until this injury, and I felt really good. It's a 28 pitch climb. And it's just so beautiful. It's on El Gigante in Mexico. And so I'd like to go there. And then also I have a goal on El Capitan in Yosemite. So yeah, those are my climbing goals for sure.
Okay, so again, thank you, Sasha, so much for participating and taking a part of this interview for the Israeli climbing community. And we have quite a few guests from abroad, which is really exciting. You are more than welcome to Israel. I think we can do a lot of real interesting things, maybe even have a festival or a camp or whatever.